Hello, and welcome to Talk the Walk. I'm Azam Khan. Global issues like the Ukraine conflict and increasing confrontation toward China by the US are changing the geopolitical landscape drastically and fluidly. Tech advancements, social media, echo chambers, and complex globalization have spurred more use of the term hybrid warfare amongst experts, statesmen, and the military alike, a blend of irregular, conventional, and cyber warfare. It is something every superpower has more frequently accused the other of deploying more, from foreign election meddling to fake news. Think of how an espionage movie would depict the 1960s during the Cold War, but with today's interconnectivity on every level. My guest today is a researcher and investigator into hybrid warfare and color revolutions. She is an Italian-born, Hong Kong-based former academic and researcher who has taught at universities in Hong Kong and has had her work published across Asia. Laura Ruggeri. Ms. Ruggeri, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me.
Thank you, Hazam, for having me. Thank you to walk the talk. Great name, by the way.
You've researched and published extensively on hybrid warfare and its deployment for color revolutions. Can you first just talk about what the term means?
Well, color revolutions are an example of hybrid warfare because they weaponize mass protests. The success of a color revolution does not depend on whether the majority of the population supports the protest. It's enough for the organizers to gather a critical mass whose activities pose a security challenge to the government. And when this critical mass provokes a violent reaction from the authorities, then the organizers try to occupy the moral high ground. They point out the repressive nature of the ruling government and thus justify their violent acts as if it was a case of self-defense. So as a rule, protesters receive help from abroad. Organizers rely on communication networks and news outlets they have set up before the color revolution even started, because they need to reach as many people as possible in order to influence them ideologically and in order to coordinate their activities. They use all available techniques of propaganda and public relations. They use all social media platforms, and of course they are supported and cheered on by Western media and governments. A color revolution is a well-designed and planned operation with clear and very focused messages. It's not spontaneous. But of course, activists are not aware that they are being used as a pawn by foreign entities. So to go back to your question about hybrid warfare, actually, it's not something new. Unconventional non-military methods to gain an advantage over an adversary have been used for a very long time.
Yeah, we've seen it during the Cold War, but it was shown in a different way because of the technology back then, and we see that now. But now because of the interconnectivity, social media, the use of different non-state actors, so it's a different form now. Is that correct?
Yes, but again, there is a mention of a type of hybrid war activities even in Greek times. You know, Thucydides mentions them. So yeah, even in ancient times. What is new is the capability to synchronize operations on a global scale, and that's something that only new technology have allowed. Because in a hybrid conflict, any instrument of national power can be used as a weapon. By definition, it's a multi-domain warfare. So battles can be fought at the diplomatic or legal level, in the information sphere, which is the main domain. But we talk also about economic and financial wars, talk about sanctions, psychological operations, terrorism, sabotage, cyber attacks.
Elections, yeah. So in Hong
Even
Kong,
human rights and foreign
yeah,
aid have been weaponized.
yeah, weaponizing different political hot topics. The Hong Kong government and other voices have highlighted that the protests in Hong Kong had color revolution's seeds in it, and that the national security law was something that was supposed to tackle that and weed out any sovereign disrupting agents, so to speak. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, the US National Endowment for Democracy actually started funding anti-China parties and organizations and media outlets even before Hong Kong was returned to China. And when in 2003, Hong Kong wanted to, the Hong Kong government, Mrs. Regina Ip, the Secretary for Security, wanted to introduce Article 23 of the Basic Law, these forces manufactured an opposition movement against the bill. People were led to believe that implementing this law would have eroded Hong Kong freedoms, would have installed a totalitarian regime. Never mind that all the countries that they held up as a paragon of freedom and democracy had very similar laws to protect their sovereignty. So failing to pass a national security law 20 years ago exposed Hong Kong to the security risks that we all know. With Article 23, foreign forces couldn't have orchestrated the 2014 Occupy Central protest, a protest that paralyzed the city for over 2 months. And there would have been no riots, casualties, destruction in 2019, 2020.
Yeah, and you
So
mentioned
finally, the national security law was implemented in 2020, and that has closed the door to foreign interference in Hong Kong.
Yeah, and you mentioned the NED, and every country has its list of, just so it's clear to the audience, every country has its list of NGOs that they deem are security threats in one form or the other. The United States, India has a lot. So why did Hong Kong receive such, or did it receive such specific scrutiny for its certain blacklisting of NGOs around 2019, 2020? Did you think it was a certain emphasis on that when a lot of countries have their own criteria of NGOs and what have you that they find are disrupting to its state or sovereignty?
Well, we all know about double standards, don't we? So for a long time, NGOs have been weaponized. They've been used as tools of hybrid warfare in many countries. In the past, the Hong Kong government didn't effectively regulate the activities of NGOs because it had no legal framework to do so. Without a national security law, it was difficult to prevent these biased NGOs from operating in Hong Kong. So up until 2020, collusion with foreign or external forces was still legal, and Western-funded NGOs could act as a conduit for political and for ideological influence. For instance, NGOs have been used in many countries for smear campaigns that targeted and undermined the reputation of governments, politicians, political candidates, other public figures. And last but not least, some of these NGOs' employees are sent to sensitive areas to gather intelligence. So it's no surprise that many countries have banned them, and the list of those that do ban them is actually growing. And it seems that governments are realizing that these NGOs have a detrimental effect on their societies.
Right. And obviously the Ukraine conflict, it's another place which is a hotspot from all sides that have accused the other of using hybrid warfare and fake news, and the list goes on. And it stems back many years prior to just when the Ukraine conflict had started. A long-standing battle between NATO and Russia. But now with China playing a key role in world affairs and trying to mediate that, can you talk about the delicate balancing act that China has to strike when it's doing this, especially with regards to, a lot of the elements that you were just pointing out to, the complexity when it comes around the hybrid warfare of it all?
Well, the conflict in Ukraine, is a U.S. proxy war, and it's the evolution of a long-running hybrid war that featured two color revolutions in one country, and they led to regime change and to civil war. So the main goal of these operations was to separate Ukraine from Russia. Russia, let's not forget, was its largest economic partner. And another goal was to tear it away from the Russian world. Ukraine's history is very much part of Russian history. It's a shared history that predates the USSR. So the US and its vassals in the European Union tried to erase memory and erase all traces of that common history in order to pull Ukraine into the West's sphere of influence. And the aim was to turn it into a springboard for hostile operations against Russia. Ukraine's history was rewritten. Neoliberal prescriptions destroyed its economy, its social fabric, led to a new colonial form of governance.
I need to pause you right there while we step away for a quick break. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with Laura Ruggeri. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Talk the Walk. I'm speaking with scholar and researcher Laura Ruggeri. Ms. Ruggeri, we were talking about the hybrid warfare and the balancing act now that China has to play with regards to Ukraine conflict and the complexity of that. So what are some factors that needs to be taken in?
Ukraine has lost its sovereignty long before Russian troops crossed its borders, and it is held hostage to US interests. But obviously, Western media would never acknowledge the US capture of Ukraine and other post-Soviet countries, because the US achieved these geopolitical objectives using instruments of hybrid warfare. There are many ways to invade and occupy a country without making headlines.
Right.
China has presented a 12-point peace plan for Ukraine, and the plan was well received in Moscow, was very criticized by the US, as expected. I believe that China is playing a constructive role. I mean, all genuine efforts to bring about a peaceful resolution of the conflict.
And they're coming off of a nice credibility with regards to Iran and Saudi Arabia, and now as we speak, there's peace talks happening in Sana'a over the Yemen conflict. That was spurred on by China's mediation.
Yes. West Asia, also known as the Middle East,
Correct.
Sits at the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and Africa. So for thousands of years, it's been vital to trade routes and transport. Today, it sits at the heart of the global economy. The millions of people and billions of tons of freight move through this region. I mean, it's a key node of global trade and also one of the main oil and gas producing regions. The US tried to grab its natural resources through the age-old divide and rule strategy. The result was decades of wars, regime change, chaos. So I think that peaceful relations among the two main regional powers will be a driver for future development and also have a direct and positive impact on the livelihoods of millions of people. The resumption of diplomatic relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia is also a prerequisite for the cessation of hostilities in Yemen. This is a 9-year-long war.
I think the UN has deemed it the largest humanitarian crisis in the last several years.
Yes, I mean, hundreds of thousands of people have died and many more have suffered from famine and disease. So it's a real tragedy and one that is not really covered very much by the media. Syria is another country that will definitely benefit by improved relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And as a matter of fact, Saudi Arabia plans to invite the Syrian president, Bashar al-Assad, to the Arab League summit that will be held in Riyadh May, I think, May 15, I think. So yes, it's a game changer, and and soon these countries will become members of the expanded Brics bloc. China rejects zero-sum games and encourages peaceful relations between countries. And it does that because it's confident that mutual respect and dialogue and cooperation lead to economic, social, and cultural progress. And ultimately, that benefits everyone. Well, maybe not so much the weapon manufacturers,
Right.
but the US isn't happy about Beijing's diplomatic success. China won friends in the region by building bridges rather than destroying them. And the bridge is a fitting metaphor because it's a metaphor for connectivity, mutual understanding, exchanges. If you think about, the US has sown chaos and division. It has inspired and funded Islamic terrorists in order to have an excuse to invade countries under the guise of waging a war on terror. It imposed sanctions to bring countries to their knees, plunge millions of people into poverty, and it keeps ramming its liberal ideology down everyone's throat.
Right. And
Has shown very little respect for local cultures. That's not China's approach.
yeah.
China is respecting local cultures and is engaging these countries in a development project that will bring great benefit to their populations. So
Right.
it's obvious that the growing influence of the Brics Plus bloc has shaken the White House. I mean, you've
Yeah.
seen US
It's
diplomats have been touring the world on a campaign to bully countries from Africa,
right.
Asia, Latin
All,
America
it's
to
all to counter.
support
Yeah.
to support the Western-led sanctions on Russia.
Right.
But look at the reaction. The reaction has
It's
been mixed.
it's
I
yeah.
mean,
It's all. Yeah, you're right. And also with Brazil ditching the petrodollar and trying and talking to trade in its own currency with China with regards to oil, natural gas. So all of this, I want to link this now to. I really want to get your thoughts on Macron's recent trip to Beijing, and you might have seen that a day after after he left, he made the comments about the importance of China's role in world affairs, and Europe should have its own sovereignty as well. He seems to be inspired perhaps by Xi Jinping's focus on a multipolar world, and now Macron basically echoed that. And he's gotten a lot of scrutiny from the media, from the Western media, since he said that. But that's always something like France has always been a very interesting, it's very strong ties with China, but it's not part of the Five Eye Alliance. And Macron himself has, in his past, he's had a non-NATO sort of stance. I believe and France in general, they removed the headquarters of NATO from Paris in 1967 in fear of US influence over Europe. Macron himself has talked about Europe having its own army to replace the NATO army. He's mentioned that before. So could you just talk about the impact of those words and how that's playing into Xi Jinping's multipolar world aspirations?
Yes. Now, if you remember that in 2021, high-ranking French officials said that France had been stabbed in the back when Australia pulled out of a multi-billion-dollar defense deal and signed a new deal with the US and the UK to obtain nuclear power submarines. US-France relations have always ebbed and flowed. I mean, in 2003, there was a dispute between Paris and Washington over the recourse to war in Iraq. And
Right.
many of the root causes of that disagreement between the US and France have not been fully addressed. I mean, the dispute over the US war in Iraq was only a symptom of deeper problems over and divergences over the role they want to play in the international order. Last week, France made a historic liquid gas sale to China in yuan, which, in my opinion, is very significant. And I believe that the business community in France is even more interested in strategic autonomy, autonomy from the US, than Macron himself. Business leaders are rather pragmatic. They understand that the world order is rapidly changing. The center of economic gravity has shifted to Asia. And as US hegemony declines and the dollar loses its dominance in the global economy, obviously business leaders are eager to jump on the Chinese high-speed train, so to speak. Macron said that Europe should not become a vassal and must avoid being drawn into any conflict between the US and China over Taiwan. He also emphasized the risk to Europe posed by the US Inflation Reduction Act, which is a green subsidy plan that provides an unfair advantage to US companies. And he mentioned the risk of an overdependence on the US dollar. What he said simply reflects the dominant opinion in Europe. But as much as I would like to see European countries distance themselves from the US, and because of its confrontational stance, I'm also aware that the US is hostage to that the EU is hostage to the US. Not only because Europe is dotted with so many US and NATO bases, but also because many European leaders serve US interests rather than the interests of their citizens. So, as expected, Anglo-American media criticized Macron's intention to defend the strategic autonomy of France. But behind Macron stands the French business community, which has realized that if the US ramps up tensions with China over Taiwan, Europe will again become collateral damage. So decoupling from China would deal a mortal blow to the French economy. Now, the question is, can Macron deliver on his promise to stay out of the US confrontation with China? Because in Macron's case, we are talking about a president whose popularity at home is in free fall. I mean, there are protests and strikes every day, and they are shaking France. They've been going on for over a month. And, will the US allow Macron to hold on to power if he seeks autonomy? So there are a lot of questions here.
Ms. Ruggeri, we're going to have to stop right there. I believe that's all the time we have. But thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me.
Thank you, Azam.
Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you the same time next week. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.